In the earliest age, before kings ruled the heavens and before thunder had a master, there existed a time when the universe itself was still unsettled, shifting, breathing, alive with forces that had not yet taken shape into order. It was within this raw, trembling cosmos that Hecate first came into being, not as a minor figure born into an already structured divine hierarchy, but as something far older, something rooted in the very fabric of existence itself. Her presence did not begin with Olympus, nor was it defined by the authority of Zeus. Instead, she emerged from powers that predated his reign, powers that shaped reality before it had a ruler. According to Hesiod in his foundational work Theogony, her birth placed her among the second generation of divine beings, children of the Titans who themselves were born from the earliest cosmic entities. Her father, Perseus, was no ordinary Titan. His domain was not simply violence or ruin in the crude sense, but the deeper, more necessary aspect of destruction, the kind that clears away what is old, what is stagnant, what must end so that something new may emerge. He represented that quiet but inevitable force that breaks apart the world only to allow it to be remade. And her mother, Asteria, carried within her the mystery of the night sky itself, the language of stars, and the prophetic whispers that travel through darkness. Asteria was not merely a passive figure in myth. Her story carried defiance and transformation, themes that would echo powerfully in her daughter. When Zeus, still rising to power, pursued her with relentless desire, she refused him. Rather than submit, she transformed herself into a quail and cast herself into the sea, becoming the island known as Delos. This act was not just escape. It was transformation as resistance, a crossing of boundaries between form and essence. And that idea, that power of shifting between states, would become central to Hecate's identity. From these two forces, destruction that makes way for creation and prophetic darkness that reveals hidden truths, Hecate was born. But she was not simply a combination of her parents. What emerged was something more complex, something that did not belong fully to any single domain. She became a goddess of thresholds, of in-between spaces, of the unseen edges where one state becomes another. Not earth alone, not sky alone, not sea alone, but the crossings between them. This is what made her different from nearly every other deity that would later populate Greek mythology. While others ruled over defined territories, sky, ocean, underworld, Hecate existed in the margins and the transitions. And in a universe where change is constant, those margins are where the true power lies. When the great conflict known as the Titanomachy erupted, reshaping the cosmos and deciding the fate of divine rule, most of the Titans chose sides. They fought, they resisted, and ultimately they fell. One by one, they were overthrown and cast into Tartarus, their powers stripped, their dominion erased or redistributed among the victors. It was a violent restructuring of existence itself, a moment where the old order was shattered completely. But Hecate did something no one else did. She did not fight. She did not stand beside the Titans, nor did she openly align herself with Zeus and the rising Olympians. Instead, she remained apart, observing, existing between sides, just as she existed between worlds. To some, it may have seemed like neutrality, but in truth, it was something deeper, an understanding that this conflict was not hers. She was not bound to a single order, and so she did not fall with one. And when the war ended, when Zeus stood victorious and began distributing power among the new divine hierarchy, something extraordinary happened. Hecate did not lose her authority. She did not need to beg for favor, nor did she have to earn her place again. Zeus himself confirmed her power. In fact, he granted her something no other Titan retained in such fullness: a threefold dominion over earth, sea, and sky. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was recognition. Zeus understood something fundamental, that Hecate's power was not tied to territory, but to connection. She governed the spaces where realms meet, where transitions occur, where decisions are made and realities shift. On Earth, She ruled the crossroads, the places where travelers must choose their path, where fate can diverge in an instant. At sea, she governed the mysterious depths, the unknown waters where life began and where the boundary between known and unknown dissolves. In the sky, she held authority over the spaces between stars, where messages pass, where omens are written in light and darkness. She was not a ruler in the traditional sense. She was a keeper of passage, and that is why she endured. While other deities depended on structure, on hierarchy, on control, Hecate existed in something far more resilient: the inevitability of change. Every ending, every beginning, every decision, every crossing, all of them fell, in some way, under her domain. Her connection to the stars through Asteria gave her insight beyond time itself. Ancient people did not see the stars as distant objects, but as active forces shaping destiny. Through this lineage, Hecate could read those patterns, understand the hidden currents guiding events long before they unfolded. She did not simply react to fate, she understood it. And through Perseus, she held power over endings. Not cruel destruction, but necessary endings, the kind that clears the path forward, the decay that allows growth. The closing of one door, so another may open. Together, these made her something rare in mythology. Not just a goddess, but a principle, a force that exists wherever something changes. And because of that, her origins could never be confined to just one story. Some traditions would later claim she was the daughter of Zeus and Demeter, tying her to the cycles of life and harvest. Others would push her even further back, naming her as a child of Nyx and Tartarus itself, placing her among the oldest forces in existence. Each version was not a contradiction, but a reflection of how ancient and difficult to define she truly was. Because Hecate was never just one thing. She was every threshold, every moment where something becomes something else. And long before temples, before rituals, before statues stood at crossroads, she was already there, waiting in the space between what was and what would be. As time moved forward and the chaotic age of raw creation slowly settled into a more structured cosmos under the rule of Zeus, something equally important began to take shape, not in the heavens, but in the minds of mortals. Humanity, watching the world around them, began trying to understand the forces that govern their lives. Storms, harvests, death, birth, dreams, shadows, all demanded explanation. And among these mysteries, few were as difficult to grasp as the unseen transitions between states of existence. It was here, in this uncertainty, that the presence of Hecate began to emerge more clearly in human awareness. At first, she was not depicted in the elaborate or iconic form that would later define her. The earliest traces of her worship suggest something far more subtle. She was honored not as a dominant Olympian figure seated on a throne, but as a presence, something felt at boundaries rather than seen directly. Early shrines dedicated to her were simple, often placed at the edges of settlements, near roads that diverged or in places where wilderness met civilization. These were not grand temples, but quiet markers acknowledging that a threshold existed and that something watched over it. When artisans of the archaic Greek world first attempted to represent her physically, they faced a problem unlike any they encountered with other gods. How do you carve into stone a being that is not confined to one place, one role, or even one moment in time? How do you depict a goddess who exists simultaneously in the past, present, and future, and who governs not a location, but the spaces between locations? The earliest solution was simple. She was shown as a single figure, a woman standing, often holding objects that hinted at her nature: torches, keys, sometimes small animals. These early statues captured only fragments of her identity. They showed her as a guide, a guardian, perhaps even a protector, but they did not yet express the full complexity of her being. Over time, however, something changed. As Greek understanding of the divine deepened, as philosophical thought evolved and religious practices became more intricate, it became increasingly clear that a single form could not contain Hecate. Her essence was too vast, too fluid. She was not a goddess who looked in one direction. She looked in all directions. She did not experience time as a straight line. She existed across it. And so, a revolutionary idea took shape. The single form split. The goddess became three. This was the birth of what would later be known as the Hecatean, the triple-bodied representation that would define her for centuries. Instead of one figure, there were now three standing back to back, each facing a different direction. It was not merely an artistic choice. It was a solution to a profound theological problem. This form allowed mortals to understand, at least visually, what could not be explained in simple words. Each face, each body, represented a different aspect of her awareness. One looked toward what had already happened, the past. This aspect held memory, ancient knowledge, forgotten truths. It understood the origins of things, the hidden causes behind present events. Another faced the present, the immediate moment, the unfolding reality that humans experienced every day. This was the aspect that illuminated what was happening now, revealing what was hidden in plain sight. And the third faced forward, toward what had not yet come to pass, the future. This aspect held potential, possibility, the unknown paths that lay ahead. Together, they formed a complete awareness that no other deity possessed in quite the same way. This triple form also solved another problem: space. Hecate was not tied to a single direction. At a crossroads, danger or opportunity could come from any path. By facing all directions at once, she became the perfect guardian of these places. No traveler could approach unnoticed. No spirit could slip through without her awareness. This is why her statues were placed at triodos, three-way crossroads. These locations were not chosen randomly. To the ancient Greeks, a crossroads was not just a point on a map. It was a moment of decision made physical. When a person stood at such a place, they were not just choosing a road, they were choosing a future. And that is where Hecate's power was strongest. People began to leave offerings at these crossroads, not out of simple habit, but out of understanding. They believed that in these places, the boundary between the human world and the unseen was thin. A decision made there carried weight. A prayer spoken there traveled further. A mistake made there could have consequences beyond what could be immediately seen. Her presence at Crossroads also connected deeply with fear. Not blind fear, but a respectful awareness of the unknown. Night travelers would approach these intersections cautiously. The darkness, the silence, the sense of being watched. It all contributed to the belief that these were not ordinary places. And in many ways, they weren't. Because crossroads were not just physical, they were spiritual. It was believed that spirits gathered there. That the dead, wandering between worlds, were drawn to these intersections. That unseen forces moved along these paths, just as humans did. And among all these movements, Hecate stood as both guardian and ruler. This is where another important aspect of her identity became more defined. She was not only a goddess of transitions between life events, she was also deeply connected to the boundary between life and death. Unlike Hermes, who guided souls from the world of the living to the underworld, Hecate's role was more complex. She did not simply escort the dead. She governed the space in which they lingered, the uncertain state between departure and arrival. She understood what it meant to exist between worlds because that was her very nature. This connection to the dead began to shape how people viewed her. She became associated with ghosts, spirits, and night wanderings. Stories began to spread of her moving through the darkness, accompanied by unseen beings. Some described hearing the distant sound of dogs howling when she passed, a sound that became one of her most recognizable signs. Dogs, sensitive to things humans could not perceive, were believed to react to her presence before anyone else could. And so, the image of Hecate began to grow darker, but not in a purely negative way. She was not evil. She was necessary. She represented the parts of existence that could not be avoided, the unknown, the unseen, the inevitable changes that no one could escape. Her symbols began to reflect this more clearly. The key, often seen in her hand, represented her authority over thresholds. It was not just a physical key, but a symbol of access to knowledge, to hidden realms, to transitions that others could not control. With it, she could open or close passages between worlds. The torch became another defining symbol. Unlike the bright, overwhelming light associated with gods like Apollo, Hecate's light was different. It was softer, more focused. It did not erase darkness. It revealed what was within it. Her torches were carried at night, guiding those who walked through uncertainty, illuminating paths that would otherwise remain hidden. And then there were the serpents. These creatures, often misunderstood, were deeply symbolic in ancient thought. They shed their skin, renewing themselves, transforming. They lived both above and below ground, moving between worlds just as Hecate did. Their presence around her was not random. It was a reflection of her power over transformation, over cycles of change, over the shedding of one state of being to become another. As her worship expanded, these symbols were not just artistic. They became tools and rituals. People began to call upon Hecate not only for protection, but for guidance in matters that involved uncertainty or change. Decisions, transitions, endings, beginnings, all fell under her domain. She was invoked during births, during marriages, during deaths. Whenever a threshold was crossed, her presence was acknowledged. And slowly, her role grew even further. She became a goddess of knowledge, particularly hidden knowledge. Not the kind taught openly, but the kind that required effort, risk, and understanding to obtain. This included practices that many feared or misunderstood: divination, communication with spirits, the use of herbs and rituals to influence unseen forces. Those who sought this knowledge often did so in secret, at night, at crossroads, in places where the boundary between worlds was thin. And always Hecate was there, watching, guiding, or, for those who were careless or disrespectful, withholding. Because Hecate did not give her knowledge freely. It had to be earned. And those who misunderstood her nature, who treated her power lightly, often found themselves lost. Not just physically, but spiritually. This dual nature, guide and guardian, protector and tester, made her one of the most complex figures in Greek belief. She was not easily categorized. She did not fit neatly into the structure that defined other gods. She existed at the edges of that structure. And perhaps that is why she endured. Because while kingdoms rise and fall, while gods gain and lose power, one thing never changes. There will always be crossroads. There will always be moments where a choice must be made. There will always be a space between what is known and what is not. And in that space, Hecate remains. As the understanding of Hecate continued to spread across the Greek world, her presence became something far more intimate than distant temple worship or grand mythological narratives. Unlike many gods who were honored primarily in large sanctuaries or through state rituals, Hecate entered the daily rhythm of life in a way that was both subtle and deeply personal. She was not only invoked in moments of crisis or celebration. She was acknowledged in the quiet, in between spaces of existence, in routines that repeated night after night, generation after generation. One of the most defining expressions of her worship came through what became known as some sought answers through dreams, calling upon Hecate to send visions during sleep. Others used objects, mirrors, bowls of water, firelight, to focus their perception, believing that under the right conditions, the boundary between worlds could briefly open. But perhaps the most complex and demanding practices were those involving direct communication with spirits. These were not undertaken lightly. Those who attempted them understood the risks. The unseen world was not entirely benevolent, and not every voice that answered was trustworthy. This is why Hecate's role was so important. She was not just a gateway, but a guardian. Without her protection, such practices could lead to confusion, deception, or worse. Practitioners would often perform these rituals at night, at crossroads, or in places where the boundary between worlds was naturally thin, caves, shorelines, abandoned paths. The timing mattered as well. The dark moon, when light was absent, was considered the most powerful moment, when Hecate's presence was strongest. They would call upon her, not with casual words, but with carefully learned invocations passed down through instruction. These words were believed to resonate with her nature, drawing her attention, aligning the ritual with her domain. And if she responded, it was not always in the way expected. Sometimes the answer came as a vision, sometimes as a sudden understanding, sometimes as a sign in the environment, a shift in wind, a sound, a movement that carried meaning beyond its surface. And sometimes there was silence, which in itself was also an answer, because Hecate did not respond to every call. She was not a servant of human curiosity. She chose when to reveal. This selective nature only deepened her reputation. She was not easily approached, but for those who earned her attention, the knowledge she offered was unlike anything else. It was not always comforting. Often, it revealed difficult truths, paths that required sacrifice, endings that could not be avoided, but was always real. And in a world where uncertainty was constant, that kind of truth was invaluable. Over time, her worship became layered, simple for some, complex for others. A family leaving offerings at a crossroads might never attempt deeper rituals, and yet they still honored her presence. A practitioner seeking hidden knowledge might dedicate years to understanding her symbols, her patterns, her silence. Both forms of devotion were valid, because Hecate did not belong to one group. She existed wherever there was a boundary. And as long as humans continued to face the unknown, to make choices, to seek answers, to cross from one state of life into another, her presence would remain, unseen but never absent. There are moments in myth where everything shifts, where a single event ripples outward and reshapes not just the lives of gods and mortals, but the very structure of the world itself. One of those moments began quietly, almost peacefully, in a meadow filled with flowers. It was there that Persephone, daughter of Demeter, wandered among blooming fields, unaware that her life and the balance of the cosmos was about to change forever. The earth split open. From beneath, Hades emerged, seizing Persephone and pulling her into the depths before the world above could react. It was sudden, violent, and absolute. The ground closed again, sealing the path, leaving no visible trace of what had just occurred. For those who lived within the ordinary limits of sight and sound, the event vanished as quickly as it had happened. But not everything in the universe is bound by those limits. In the silence that followed, as the echoes of Persephone's cry faded into the unseen, one being heard her. Hecate. She did not witness the abduction with her eyes, nor did she stand in the meadow as it happened. Her awareness worked differently. She perceived what moved between worlds, what slipped through the cracks of reality. Persephone's cry was not just a sound. It was a rupture, a crossing, a forced transition from one state of existence to another. And that was something Hecate could not ignore. She emerged from the places she inhabited, the thresholds, the edges, the unseen pathways, and moved toward the disturbance. Unlike the Olympian gods, who often required time, messengers, or confirmation before acting, Hecate responded immediately. Her nature did not allow her to remain passive when a boundary had been violently broken. Meanwhile, Demeter began her search. Her grief was immediate and overwhelming. She wandered the earth, refusing food, rest, or comfort, calling out for her daughter with a desperation that echoed through every field and valley. Crops began to fail. The land itself seemed to mirror her sorrow. But despite her power, despite her determination, she could not find Persephone. It was in this moment, when knowledge was scarce and despair was growing, that Hecate approached her. She did not come with false comfort. She came with truth. But she also knew where answers could be found. Together, they sought out Helios, the one being whose position in the cosmos allowed him to witness everything that occurred under the light of day. Hecate's decision to involve Helios was not random. It showed her understanding of the divine order. She knew who held knowledge, who could reveal what others could not. When Helios spoke, the truth came fully into the light. Hades had taken Persephone, and more than that, he had done so with the silent consent of Zeus. This revelation changed everything. What had seemed like a violent crime now became something far more complex, a decision made within the highest level of divine authority. It was no longer simply a matter of rescue. It was political, cosmic, bound by agreements that governed even the gods themselves. Demeter's grief turned to fury. She withdrew her gifts from the earth entirely. Crops failed. Famine spread. Humanity began to suffer. And with them, the balance of the world itself began to collapse. This was no longer just a family tragedy. It was a crisis that threatened the entire order of existence. And through all of this, Hecate remained, not as a distant observer, but as a constant presence. She did not possess the authority to overturn Zeus's decision. She could not command Hades to release Persephone. But she did something equally important. She guided, she advised, she supported. Where Demeter's emotions surged and overwhelmed, Hecate provided clarity. Where the path forward was uncertain, she helped illuminate it. Her role during this period is often understated, but it is critical, because she understood something that others did not. Persephone was no longer simply lost. She had crossed a boundary, and once a boundary is crossed, it cannot simply be undone. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Zeus intervened, recognizing that the destruction of the mortal world could not continue. It was decided that Persephone would not remain in the underworld permanently, but neither could she return fully to the world above. Because she had eaten the seeds of the pomegranate while in Hades' realm, she was bound to it. The solution was balance. Part of the year, she would remain with Hades as queen of the underworld. The other part, she would return to her mother, bringing life back to the earth. This cycle became the foundation of the seasons. But within this solution, there remained a problem. Transition. Moving between the world of the living and the world of the dead was not simple. It was not safe. It required guidance, protection, and understanding of both realms. And there was only one being suited for that role. Hecate. She became Persephone's companion. Not just once, but every time the transition occurred. When Persephone descended into the underworld, Hecate guided her path. When she returned to the surface, Hecate was there again, ensuring the crossing was completed safely. This was not a temporary duty. It became her role. In doing so, Hecate's connection to the underworld deepened in a way that set her apart from nearly every other deity. She was not bound to it like Hades, nor did she simply visit it like Hermes. She moved between it and the upper world freely, acting as a bridge that maintained the balance between both. Her identity expanded. She was no longer only a goddess of crossroads in the mortal world. She became a guardian of the greatest crossroads of all, the boundary between life and death. This is where her role as a guide of souls became more defined. While Hermes escorted souls to the underworld, Hecate oversaw what came after. She understood the complexities of existence within that realm, the transitions that continued even after death. She guided not just movement, but transformation. And through Persephone, she gained something else. Trust. Their relationship was not one of command, but of companionship. Persephone, who existed in two worlds, needed someone who understood that duality. Hecate, who had always existed between realms, was the perfect guide. Together, they formed a connection that shaped how the underworld itself was perceived. It was no longer just a place of finality. It became part of cycle, and Hecate stood at the center of that cycle. Over time, this role influenced how mortals viewed death. It was no longer seen only as an end, but as a transition, one that required guidance, preparation, and respect. Hecate became a figure invoked not just in life, but at the moment of death itself. People prayed for her presence in their final moments, hoping she would guide them safely across that last threshold. because if anyone understood how to move between worlds, it was her. And so, from a single cry in a meadow, her role evolved into something even greater. Not just a guardian of Crossroads, but a keeper of the path between life and death. As the role of Hecate expanded through her connection with Persephone and her constant movement between worlds, something began to change in how mortals perceived her. It wasn't that her nature had altered. Her essence had always been tied to thresholds, to unseen spaces, to transformation. But now, as her presence became more closely associated with death, spirits, and the underworld, the human understanding of her grew heavier, darker, and more layered. Fear entered the picture, not as ignorance, but as recognition. Because the more people tried to understand what lay beyond life, the more they realized how little control they truly had. And in that uncertainty, Hecate stood not as a comforting figure, but as a necessary one. She did not promise safety. She offered guidance. And those are not the same thing. In the growing tradition surrounding her, she became known not only as a guardian, but as a ruler of spirits, beings that existed in the uneasy space between life and death. These were not the honored dead who had settled into their place in the underworld, nor were they fully part of the living world. There was something in between, restless, wandering, sometimes confused, sometimes dangerous. And it was believed that Hecate commanded them. This idea gave rise to one of her most powerful and unsettling titles, the Queen of Ghosts. Not in the sense of ruling a distant kingdom, but in the sense of moving among them, directing them, controlling their movement across the boundaries that separated realms. She was not isolated from these spirits. She was surrounded by them. Stories began to circulate more frequently, whispered rather than declared. People spoke of nights when the air felt heavy, when silence carried a strange weight, when shadows seemed to move independently of the light. These moments were often attributed to Hecate's passing, not alone, but accompanied by her retinue of unseen followers. Among these, the most vivid descriptions involved processions, not visible in the way a human gathering would be, but sensed. A shift in the environment, a sudden chill, the unmistakable feeling that something was moving through the darkness with purpose. Dogs would react first, howling, whining, or refusing to remain still. Then came the silence that followed, deeper than ordinary quiet, as if the world itself paused. These were believed to be the nights when Hecate walked, not as a distant goddess, but as an active presence in the world. Her connection to magic grew stronger during this period, not as something separate from her nature, but as an extension of it. Magic in the ancient sense was not about spectacle, it was about influence. The ability to affect unseen forces, to understand patterns hidden beneath reality, to work within the boundaries that governed existence. And no one understood boundaries better than Hecate. Those who practiced these arts, often quietly, often away from public attention, looked to her as a guide. They did not see her as a source of easy power, but as a teacher of difficult truths. Her knowledge was not given freely. It required discipline, patience, and, above all, respect. Because the forces she governed were not harmless. Working with them meant stepping into the same liminal space that she inhabited, a place where the rules were different, where certainty dissolved, where intention mattered more than appearance. Practitioners learned that without proper preparation, without clear purpose, attempts to reach beyond the ordinary could lead to confusion or even harm. This is why rituals associated with Hecate became increasingly structured. Every detail mattered. The location had to be chosen carefully. Crossroads remained the most powerful, but other places where boundaries blurred were also used. Caves, shorelines, abandoned pathways, places where the natural world felt slightly unsettled. These were not random choices. They were environments where the unseen could be more easily approached. The timing was equally important. The dark moon, when the sky held no visible light, became the most sacred period for her rites. It was believed that during this phase, the separation between worlds was at its thinnest, and Hecate's presence was at its strongest. Participants in these rituals did not approach casually. They prepared. Cleansing rituals were performed beforehand, removing not just physical impurities, but mental distractions. Focus was essential. The mind had to be steady, the intention clear. Because in a space where boundaries weaken, uncertainty could invite the wrong kind of attention. Invocations were spoken, not loudly, not dramatically, but with precision. Words that had been passed down, refined over time, believed to resonate with Hecate's nature. These are not demands. They were requests, acknowledgments, invitations for a presence. And sometimes that presence was felt, not always as something visible, but as a shift, a sudden awareness that the space was no longer empty, that something was listening, that the boundary had, even if briefly, opened. In those moments, communication could occur, not in simple conversation, but through signs. A movement in the flame of a torch, a ripple in water that had no visible cause, a thought that seemed to arrive fully formed, carrying meaning beyond ordinary reasoning. But just as often, there was nothing. And this too was understood, because Hecate was not obligated to respond. Her silence was as meaningful as her presence. This selective nature added to her reputation, not just as powerful, but as unpredictable. She could guide, but she could also refuse. She could reveal, but she could also conceal. And this made her both respected and feared. Her darker image grew not because she became malevolent, but because she remained connected to aspects of existence that humans struggled to accept. Death, transformation, loss, uncertainty. These were not comforting ideas, and yet they were unavoidable. Hecate did not remove them, she illuminated them. And for many, that illumination was unsettling. Over time, this led to a shift in how she was depicted and described. Earlier, she had been seen primarily as a guardian and guide. Now, she was also seen as a figure of power within darkness itself, not consumed by it, but in command of it. This distinction is important. Darkness, in this context, was not evil, it was unknown, and Hecate was one of the few who could move within it without being lost. Her association with transformation became even more central. Not just the transformation of life into death, but of states of being. She was invoked in moments where change was unavoidable, when something had to end for something else to begin. This included not only physical transitions, but emotional and spiritual ones as well. People sought her help when they stood at difficult crossroads in their lives, when a decision carried weight, when the outcome was uncertain, when the path forward required leaving something behind. Because Hecate understood what it meant to cross those thresholds. She did not promise that the path would be easy, but she ensured that it could be navigated. And in a world filled with unpredictability, that was enough. Her presence in everyday life remained subtle but constant. Doorways, for example, were seen as smaller versions of the crossroads she governed. Every time someone entered or left a space, they crossed a boundary. And so, small offerings, quiet acknowledgments became part of daily routine. Not out of fear, but out of awareness. Because once people understood that boundaries existed everywhere, not just in dramatic moments, but in ordinary actions, they began to see Hecate not as distant, but as always near. At every beginning, at every ending, at every choice, and in every moment where something changed. Her influence did not rely on temples or grand ceremonies. It existed in the spaces between, and as long as those spaces remained, and they always would, so would she. As centuries passed and the Greek world expanded beyond its early boundaries, the influence of Hecate did not remain confined to a single region or a single interpretation. Unlike many deities whose identities were tightly bound to specific cities or traditions, Hecate moved, both literally through trade routes and culturally through ideas. Wherever people carried their beliefs, wherever they encountered new lands, new customs, new understandings of the unseen, Hecate adapted without losing her essence. This adaptability was not a weakness. It was the reason she endured. In the earlier periods of Greek religion, her worship had already been unique, more personal, more tied to daily life than its centralized temples. But as the Greek world entered the Hellenistic age, following the conquest of Alexander the Great, cultures began to blend in ways that had never happened before. Greek ideas encountered Egyptian traditions, Persian beliefs, Anatolian practices, and more. Gods were compared, merged, reinterpreted. New forms of worship emerged, combining elements from multiple traditions into something entirely new. And Hecate fit perfectly into this world, because she was already a goddess of intersections. Not just physical crossroads, but cultural ones. In regions like Asia Minor, her presence became especially strong. Here, she was not seen merely as a mysterious figure of the night, but as a powerful protector of cities and a guardian of sacred spaces. One of the most important centers of her worship developed in Lahaina, where a major sanctuary was dedicated to her. This was different from the small roadside shrines of earlier times. This was organized, structured devotion, recognized at a civic level. Yet even in this more formal setting, her essential nature did not change. She was still a goddess of boundaries. Only now, those boundaries included entire communities. Festivals were held in her honor, processions carried her symbols through the streets, and her role expanded beyond the personal into the collective. She was invoked not just for individual protection, but for the safety of cities, for the stability of regions, for the balance between human society and the forces beyond it. At the same time, her identity continued to deepen within more private, esoteric traditions. As philosophical thought evolved, particularly in schools that explored the nature of reality beyond the physical world, Hecate began to be understood in more abstract terms. She was no longer only a goddess in the mythological sense. She became a principle, a force, a representation of the structure of existence itself. In certain traditions, especially those influenced by later philosophical movements, she was seen as a mediator between realms, not just physically, but cosmically. She stood between the material world and the divine, between form and formlessness, between what could be perceived and what could only be understood. This idea aligned naturally with her earlier roles. But now, it was being expressed in a more refined, more intellectual way. Her triple form, which had once been a practical solution for representing her all-seeing nature, took on deeper symbolic meaning. It came to represent not only past, present, and future, but also different layers of reality. The visible world, the hidden world, and the realm beyond both. She was seen as existing simultaneously across these levels, connecting them, allowing movement between them. And this interpretation made her even more important to those who sought knowledge. Not ordinary knowledge, but insight into how reality itself functioned. During this period, texts began to appear that explored these ideas in greater depth. Among them were writings that would later be associated with what modern scholars call the Greek magical papyri. These documents preserved rituals, invocations, and practices that called upon Hecate in highly structured ways, often blending Greek traditions with elements from Egyptian and Near Eastern belief systems. In these texts, Hecate's identity becomes even more expansive. She is invoked not just as a goddess of crossroads, but as a cosmic force, a being who exists at every boundary simultaneously. She is called upon in complex rituals designed to reveal hidden truths, to communicate with spirits, to influence forces that lie beyond ordinary perception. But even here, one thing remains consistent. She is not approached lightly. The rituals are detailed, demanding, precise. They require preparation, discipline, and understanding. This reflects something essential about Hecate. She is not a shortcut to power. She is a path, and that path requires effort. As her worship spread, she also began to merge, in some regions, with other deities who shared similar attributes. In Egypt, for example, connections were drawn between Hecate and Isis, another powerful figure associated with magic, protection, and the unseen. While they were not identical, the similarities allowed for overlapping forms of worship, where rituals might invoke aspects of both. In other traditions, she was linked to lunar deities, reflecting her strong association with the night and the cycles of the moon. Though she was not originally a moon goddess in the same sense as Selene or Artemis, these connections grew over time, especially as her role in nighttime rituals and dark moon observances became more central. This blending did not erase her identity. It expanded it, because Hecate was never limited to one definition. She absorbed meanings, adapted to contexts, and remained relevant even as the world around her changed. By the time the Roman world began to adopt and reinterpret Greek mythology, Hecate had already become a deeply established figure. The Romans, who often identified their own gods with Greek counterparts, associated her with Trivia, a deity who shared her connection to three-way intersections. Even her name in this context, Trivia, reflected the same core idea. Three roads, three paths, three choices. And once again, the concept of the crossroads remained at the center. But perhaps the most important aspect of her evolution during these later periods was not how others changed her, but how she remained consistent beneath those changes. Empires rose, cultures blended, philosophies shifted, but the fundamental experiences that defined human life did not change. People still faced uncertainty. They still stood at moments where decisions had to be made without knowing the outcome. They still encountered loss, transformation, beginnings, endings. They still wondered what lay beyond the visible world. And in all of those moments, Hecate was still relevant. Her worship may have taken different forms. Her symbols may have evolved. Her stories may have been retold in new ways. But her essence remained untouched. She was still the presence at the threshold, still the guide in darkness, still the one who stood at the point where one reality became another. And perhaps that is why, even as many ancient deities faded into obscurity, remembered only in texts or ruins, Hecate did not disappear, because she was never tied to a single place or time. She existed wherever there was a boundary. And as long as humans continued to live in a world defined by change, she would remain, not always seen, not always understood, but always there, waiting at the crossroads. As the ancient world slowly transformed, as temples fell into ruin and the voices of old religions grew quieter beneath the rise of new beliefs, many gods faded with them. Their names became distant, their stories preserved only in fragments, studied rather than lived. But Hecate did not disappear so easily. Her presence, unlike that of many others, was never tied solely to grand temples or state rituals. It existed in something more enduring, in the human experience of uncertainty, of transition, of standing at the edge of the unknown. And that is something that never vanished. Even as the structured worship of the Greek gods declined under the expansion of the Roman Empire and later the spread of new religious systems, traces of Hecate's influence remained embedded in practices, beliefs, and fears that could not simply be erased. The crossroads did not disappear. The night did not lose its mystery. The boundary between life and death did not become any easier to understand. And so, quietly, her presence endured. In later periods, especially during the transition into what would become the medieval world, her image began to shift once again. But this time, the change was shaped by fear and misunderstanding. Practices that had once been seen as sacred, rituals involving the unseen, communication with spirits, the seeking of hidden knowledge, began to be viewed with suspicion. What had once been part of accepted religious life became associated with danger, with forbidden knowledge, with things that were no longer openly spoken of. And because Hecate had always stood at the center of those practices, her name became entangled in that transformation. She was no longer simply a guide. In some interpretations, she became something darker, not because her nature had changed, but because the world around her had. The same qualities that once made her essential, her connection to spirits, her presence in the night, her knowledge of hidden forces, were now seen through a different lens. Instead of being understood as necessary aspects of existence, They were treated as threats, as things to be avoided. And yet, even in this shift, something remained unchanged. People still turned to her, quietly, in hidden ways, because even when beliefs change, the questions that define human life do not. What happens after death? How do we face the unknown? What do we do when we stand at a moment where everything could change? These questions do not disappear, and neither did she. Her presence moved from open worship into more private traditions, into whispered practices, into knowledge passed carefully from one person to another. She became a figure associated with those who sought understanding beyond what was easily accepted, those who were willing to step into uncertainty in order to find answers. Over time, as the modern world began to take shape and interest in ancient traditions re-emerged, Hecate's story surfaced again. But now, it was approached with new perspectives. Scholars began to study texts like theogony, examining her origins through the work of Hesiod. Archaeologists uncovered statues, inscriptions, remnants of shrines at crossroads and city gates, revealing how widespread her worship had once been. And beyond academic study, something else happened. People began to recognize her again, not just as a figure of myth, but as a symbol that still held meaning. Because even in a world shaped by science, by structure, by attempts to explain everything through logic, there remain moments that cannot be reduced to simple answers. Moments where a decision must be made without certainty. Moments where something ends and something else begins, without a clear line separating the two. Moments where a person stands at a crossroads. And in those moments, the idea of Hecate still resonates. Not necessarily as a literal figure walking through the night with torches and spirits, but as a representation of something real, the experience of transition, of standing between what is known and what is not. Her symbols still carry meaning. The key remains a symbol of access, of unlocking what is hidden, whether that is knowledge, opportunity, or understanding. The torch still represents illumination, not the overwhelming light that removes all mystery, but the kind that reveals just enough to move forward. The crossroads remains one of the most powerful symbols of choice, of consequence, of paths that diverge and cannot be taken all at once. And perhaps most importantly, her presence as a guide remains. Not a guide that removes difficulty, but one that acknowledges it. Because Hecate has never been about making things easy. She has always been about making them possible. Her story, when seen as a whole, is not simply about a goddess within a pantheon. It is about something deeper, something that exists across time, across cultures, across changing beliefs. She represents the truth that life is not a straight path. It is a series of thresholds, moments where something must be left behind, moments where something new begins, moments where the outcome is uncertain, and yet the step forward must still be taken. And in every one of those moments, there is a choice. That is where Hecate lives. Not in the past alone, not in stories carved into stone, not in rituals performed under ancient skies, but in the experience itself. In the hesitation before a decision, in the silence before a new beginning, in the darkness before understanding appears. She is there, not as a force that controls the path, but as one that stands beside it, watching, waiting, not pushing, not pulling, but present. And that is why her story does not truly end. Because as long as there are boundaries to cross, as long as there are unknowns to face, as long as there are moments where a path must be chosen without knowing where it leads, Hecate remains, not as a distant memory, but as something woven into the structure of existence itself. A quiet presence at the edge of every transition. The keeper of the threshold. The one who stands where worlds meet. And the one who, even now, waits at every crossroads for those who are about to choose. And yet, even after everything, the rise and fall of gods, the reshaping of the cosmos, the descent into the underworld and back again. There is something important to understand about Hecate. Her story does not end with gods. It continues through humans. Because if Hecate is the keeper of thresholds, then it is not only divine beings who cross them. Mortals do as well. And among all mortals in Greek myth, there are few whose lives reflect the dangerous, transformative power of crossing boundaries more than Medea. Her story begins far from Greece, in the distant land of Colchis, where the edges of the known world blurred into mystery. This was not a place of familiar order, but a land that already stood at the boundary between cultures, between what was understood and what was feared. And it is no coincidence that this is where Medea was born. She was not an ordinary woman. From the beginning, she was connected to forces that others only whispered about. She was a priestess deeply devoted to Hecate, trained in rituals that most would never witness. While others might leave offerings at Crossroads and walk away, Medea did not turn her back. She stayed. She learned. She listened. And through that devotion, she became something more. Hecate did not appear to her as she did in myth. There was no sudden vision, no dramatic revelation. Instead, her presence was felt through knowledge, through the understanding of herbs, of potions, of words that carried power beyond their sound. Medea learned how to work within the boundaries that Hecate governed, how to influence what lay just beyond the visible world. But knowledge like that is never neutral. It changes the one who holds it. Medea grew into a figure who could move between roles, just as Hecate moved between realms. She was both healer and destroyer, helper and avenger, guided and yet dangerous in her own right. And like all those who walked too closely to the edge, her life would become a series of crossings, each one more irreversible than the last. Her path truly began to shift when Jason arrived in Colchis, seeking the Golden Fleece. He came as a hero, but also as an outsider, stepping into a land that was not his own, facing trials that required more than strength. And this is where Hecate's influence becomes clear. Because Jason could not succeed alone. He needed knowledge that did not belong to him. And that knowledge came through Medea. When Medea first encountered Jason, the moment was not simply one of attraction or destiny. It was a threshold, a point where her life could follow one path or another. She could remain loyal to her homeland, to her family, to the order she had always known, or she could step into something uncertain, something dangerous, something that would change everything. And she chose. But that choice did not come freely. Ancient sources often describe it as influenced by the gods, particularly Aphrodite, who caused Medea to fall deeply in love with Jason. But even within that influence, the deeper layer remains. Medea was someone already attuned to crossing boundaries, someone already standing at the edge between worlds. And so, when the moment came, she stepped forward to help Jason. She used everything she had learned under Hecate's influence. She created potions that protected him from fire-breathing bulls. She provided strategies to overcome impossible tasks. And most importantly, she gave him the means to face the dragon that guarded the Golden Fleece. Not through brute force, but through knowledge, through understanding, through the manipulation of unseen forces. This is not the work of a simple helper. This is the work of someone who understands how to move through the unseen. Someone shaped by Hecate's domain. But every crossing has a cost. In helping Jason, Medea did not simply assist him. She broke away from everything she had been. She betrayed her father, her homeland, her past. And once that threshold was crossed, there was no returning. She left Colchis with Jason. And in doing so, she entered a new world, but not one that welcomed her fully. Because those who carry knowledge of the unseen are often feared. At first, she was valued. She had helped Jason achieve what no one else could. But over time, the same abilities that made her powerful also made her dangerous in the eyes of others. She was not easily understood. She did not fit within the boundaries of ordinary life. And this is where her story begins to darken. Because Hecate's influence is not about simple victories. It is about transformation. And transformation is rarely gentle. As Medea's life unfolded, she continued to act at the edges of morality, at the boundaries of what was acceptable. She used her knowledge to heal, but also to destroy. She became a figure both respected and feared, embodying the same dual nature that defined Hecate herself: guide and threat, helper and avenger. And in the end, her story reaches one of the most tragic and unsettling conclusions in Greek mythology, a moment where the boundaries between love, revenge, justice, and destruction collapse entirely. But even in that darkness, one thing remains clear. Medea is not simply a villain. She is a figure shaped by crossing too many thresholds, by stepping too far into the spaces between, by holding knowledge that isolates as much as it empowers. And behind that journey, Hecate remains, not as a controlling force, but as a presence that exists wherever those boundaries are crossed. Medea does not act because of Hecate, but she acts within the domain that Hecate governs. This is the true extension of Hecate's story, not just in myths about gods, but in the lives of mortals who come too close to the unseen. Humans can step into those spaces too. But unlike gods, they're not always able to step back. And that is the difference. That is the danger. That is the truth that Hecate represents when her story moves beyond Olympus and into the world of human lives. Because standing at a crossroads is one thing. Choosing a path is another. But living with that choice, that is where the real story begins. And in that space, between decision and consequence, between power and cost, Hecate is still there, watching not as a judge, but as the silent witness to every crossing that cannot be undone. And even after everything that had already been set into motion, the ancient birth of Hecate, her dominion over thresholds, her place between worlds, her quiet presence in the lives of gods and mortals, her story does not remain distant, sealed within divine myth. It continues, but not in the heavens. It continues in a human life, one that would become a warning, a legend, and a reflection of what happens when someone steps too far into the spaces she governs. Far from the familiar lands of Greece, beyond the edges of what many considered civilization, there existed the distant kingdom of Colchis. It was a place already marked by its position at the boundary of the known world, a land where foreign customs, strange knowledge, and ancient practices thrived. And it is here, in this liminal place between cultures, that Medea was born. From the very beginning, her life was not ordinary. She was raised within the traditions of her people, but more importantly, she was initiated into something deeper. As a priestess devoted to Hecate, she did not merely honor the goddess in passing rituals. She lived within her domain. She learned to understand the unseen forces that moved through the world, the subtle currents that others ignored or feared. While most people approached Crossroads with caution and left offerings before retreating, Medea remained in those spaces. She studied them. She listened. And over time, she began to understand. Not just the rituals, but the meaning behind them. She learned how boundaries worked. Not only physical ones, but the invisible divisions between states of being, between health and illness, between safety and danger, between life and death. Through herbs, through spoken words, through precise actions carried out at the right moment, she learned how to influence those boundaries. But knowledge like that does not sit quietly within a person. It changes them. It reshapes how they see the world. And it separates them from those who do not share it. Medea grew into someone who could not fully belong to ordinary life anymore. She stood, like the goddess she served, at the edge of things, never fully inside, never fully outside. And then, one day that edge shifted. A ship arrived, the Argo, led by Jason. It carried men from distant lands, driven by a single purpose, to claim the Golden Fleece, an object of immense power and significance guarded within Colchis itself. To them, this was a quest, a test of strength and courage. But they had entered a land where strength alone was not enough. Jason was not the first outsider to arrive, but he was different, not because of who he was, but because of what his arrival represented. A crossing. When Medea first saw him, the moment did not stand out to others. There was no visible sign, no interruption in the flow of time. But for her, something shifted. Not simply emotion, not merely curiosity, but recognition. This was a threshold, and she was standing at it. Ancient sources often describe her reaction as the result of divine influence, particularly from Aphrodite, who compelled her to fall in love with Jason. But to understand this moment only as love is to miss its deeper meaning. Medea was already someone attuned to transformation, already someone who understood what it meant to step from one state into another. And now, she was faced with a choice: remain where she was safe, known, bound to her past, or step forward into uncertainty, into danger, into something that could not be undone. And she chose. But that choice carried consequences immediately. To help Jason, she had to act against her own world, against her father, against everything she had been raised to protect. And to do that, she turned to what she knew best, the knowledge given through her devotion to Hecate. She prepared rituals not seen by the Argonauts, not understood by them. She gathered herbs at precise moments, spoke words that carried meaning beyond their sound, and created potions that did more than protect. They altered the balance between harm and survival. When Jason faced the fire-breathing bulls, it was not his strength that saved him. It was Medea's understanding of how to stand within danger and not be consumed by it. When he was tasked with sowing dragons' teeth that would rise into armed warriors, it was her knowledge that allowed him to survive the chaos that followed. And when he approached the serpent that guarded the golden fleece, it was not battle that overcame it, but sleep, drawn upon through her mastery of forces that lay beyond the visible. Step by step, task by task, Jason succeeded, but not alone, never alone. And with each act, Medea crossed further away from her past, until there was no path back. When the moment came to leave Colchis, it was not an escape, it was a break, a complete severing of one life from another. She left behind her home, her identity, her place in the world. And in doing so, she entered a new existence that would never fully accept her. Because those who cross too many boundaries become something difficult to understand. At first, she was valued. She had made the impossible possible. She had enabled Jason's success. But as time passed, the same qualities that made her powerful began to isolate her. She was no longer just a helper. She was something unpredictable. Someone who knew too much, who could do too much. And that is where the story turns. Because the power of Hecate is not about control. It is about transformation. And transformation always demands a price. As Medea's life continued, her actions became more extreme, more desperate, more driven by forces that even she could not fully control. The same knowledge that had once protected began to destroy. The same ability to alter outcomes began to unravel them. She became a figure caught between identities, no longer fully human in the ordinary sense, but not divine either. She lived in the space between. And in the end, her story reaches a point where the boundaries collapse entirely, where love becomes indistinguishable from revenge, where justice becomes indistinguishable from destruction. It is one of the darkest endings in Greek mythology, not because it is senseless, but because it is the result of choices made at crossroads that could never be undone. And through all of it, Hecate remains, not as a force that commanded Medea, not as a voice that dictated her actions, but as the presence that exists wherever those boundaries are crossed. Medea did not become what she was because of Hecate. She became what she was because she walked too far into the spaces that Hecate governs. This is the deeper truth of the story. Hecate does not create monsters. She reveals what lies within those who step beyond the limits they once knew. She stands at the threshold, but she does not decide who crosses. Medea chose, and in choosing, she became something that could not return. That is the power of the crossroads, not the path itself, but the decision, because once it is made, there is no going back. And in that irreversible moment, in that quiet space between what was and what now must be, Hecate is there, not stopping it, not judging it, but witnessing it, as she always has, as she always will. And after the path of Medea reaches its darkest and most irreversible turning points, the story does not simply end and disappear into silence. Because what her life reveals is not an isolated tragedy, but a pattern, a reflection of what happens when a human being walks too far into the spaces governed by Hecate without fully understanding the weight of each step. And somewhere else in the vast map of myth, far from the chaos that surrounded Medea's life, another figure exists who also moves within those same boundaries, but with a different rhythm, a different outcome, and a different understanding. That figure is Circe. She does not stand at the beginning of her story in the same way Medea did. Uncertain, pulled by sudden emotion, forced into rapid decisions. Instead, Circe exists in a quieter, more controlled space. She lives in isolation on an island that itself feels like a boundary between worlds, not fully part of the human realm, not entirely removed from it either. A place where time slows, where the rules feel slightly altered, where the line between natural and unnatural becomes difficult to define. And like Medea, Circe is not separate from Hecate's influence. She is shaped by it. But where Medea's story is defined by movement, by leaving, by crossing, by breaking away, Circe's is defined by stillness, by remaining in one place and drawing the world toward her instead. She does not chase transformation. She creates a space where transformation happens. This difference matters, because it shows another side of the same force. Circe's knowledge, like Medea's, is not ordinary. She understands herbs, potions, words that carry power beyond their sound. She can alter forms, shift the nature of things, change what something is into something else entirely. But unlike Medea, she does not use this power in response to sudden crisis or emotional upheaval. She uses it deliberately, controlled, measured, and yet the nature of that power remains the same. It exists at the boundary between forms, between what something is and what it can become. This is why her most famous act, the transformation of men into animals, is not simply an act of punishment or cruelty, as it is often reduced to. It is something deeper. When the crew of Odysseus arrives on her island, they enter a space that is not entirely theirs to understand. They approach it as they would any other place, without awareness, without caution, without respect for the possibility that they are stepping into something beyond their control. And Circe responds, not with violence in the traditional sense, but with transformation. She strips away their human form, revealing something more instinctive, more basic. Turning them into animals is not just a physical change. It is symbolic of crossing a boundary without preparation, of stepping into a realm governed by different rules and losing the structure that once defined them. And in that moment, the connection to Hecate becomes clear again, because this is what happens at thresholds. They test, they reveal, they do not guarantee safety. But Circe is not merely a reflection of danger. She is also a teacher. When Odysseus himself approaches her, things unfold differently. He is warned, prepared, given the means to resist her magic. And because of that preparation, the encounter shifts. Instead of being transformed against his will, he stands within the boundary and does not lose himself. And that changes everything. Circe does not destroy him. She speaks with him. She helps him. She becomes a guide. This is the other side of Hecate's influence, the side that does not punish blindly, but responds to awareness, to readiness, to the ability to stand within the unknown without collapsing under it. And from that moment, Circe's role changes. She is no longer simply an isolated enchantress. She becomes a guide through something even more dangerous than her own island. She directs Odysseus toward the underworld. And this is where the connection returns fully to Hecate. Because to enter the underworld is to cross the greatest boundary of all. It is not something that can be done casually, not something that can be approached without knowledge. Odysseus must perform rituals, speak to spirits, navigate a space where the rules of life no longer apply. And the knowledge that allows him to do this comes from Circe, which means, in a deeper sense, it comes from the same source that shaped her, the same understanding of thresholds, the same awareness of what lies between worlds, the same influence that shaped Medea, only expressed differently. Because where Medea was consumed by the consequences of crossing too many boundaries too quickly, Circe remains in control by understanding them, by respecting them, by not rushing beyond what she can hold. And this contrast is important, because it shows that Hecate's domain is not inherently destructive. It is not inherently dangerous. It is powerful, and how that power manifests depends on the one who steps into it. Medea and Circe are not opposites. They are reflections of different paths taken within the same space. One moves too fast, driven by emotion, crossing thresholds without the ability to return. The other remains steady, allowing transformation to happen within controlled limits. And both, in their own way, carry the mark of Hecate, because her influence is not about what someone becomes. It is about what they choose when they stand at the edge of change. And through these stories, something becomes clear. Hecate's presence does not end with gods. It does not remain fixed in one myth. It echoes through different lives, through different choices, through different outcomes, always at the same point, the threshold, the moment before transformation, the space where something can become something else. And whether that transformation leads to ruin, like Medea, or to understanding, like Circe, depends on how that moment is faced. But the presence at that moment, the silent witness, the unseen guide, the keeper of that space, remains the same, always. As the stories of figures like Medea and Circe continue to circulate across generations, something subtle began to happen in the way people thought about them. They were no longer only treated as distant mythological accounts or simple tales of gods and magic. They began to be interpreted as reflections of deeper truths, attempts, however symbolic, to describe the structure of reality itself. And at the center of that interpretation still stood Hecate, not as a character in a story anymore, but as a concept that seemed to explain something fundamental, the existence of transition itself. Because whether one is speaking of gods, mortals, or philosophers, there is always the same problem that returns again and again. Reality does not remain fixed. It shifts. It changes. It moves from one state to another in ways that are not always visible, not always predictable, and not always controllable. Life becomes death. Ignorance becomes knowledge. Chaos becomes order. And then order breaks again. Ancient thinkers in the Greek world began to notice this pattern not just in myth, but in the world around them. Philosophers who followed traditions associated with figures like Heraclitus spoke of a universe defined by constant change, where nothing remains exactly as it is. While they did not always reference the gods directly, the language they used often mirrored older mythological structures. And in that hidden reflection, Hecate's domain still appears. Because what is a crossroads philosophically, if not a model of choice within change? What is a threshold, if not the exact moment where one state becomes another? Even when stripped of mythic language, the structure remains. And so, in later interpretations, Hecate becomes something more abstract, less a goddess in a literal sense, and more a representation of liminality itself, the condition of existing between defined states. This idea was not limited to philosophy. It also appeared in religious practice, especially in mystery traditions that developed across the Greek world. These were not public rituals performed in open temples, but private, carefully guarded initiations that promised deeper understanding of life, death, and what might lie beyond. In these contexts, Hecate's role as a guide through thresholds becomes even more important, because initiation itself is a form of crossing. A person enters the ritual as one kind of self and leaves as another. What happens in between is often hidden, symbolic, or deliberately obscured. But the structure is consistent. Separation from the ordinary world, passage through a controlled experience of uncertainty, and return with transformed understanding. This pattern mirrors everything seen in earlier myths. Medea's irreversible crossing, Circe's controlled transformation, Odysseus's descent into the underworld. All of them reflect the same underlying structure, movement through a boundary that changes the nature of the one who crosses it. And in later philosophical thought, this begins to take on an even broader meaning. The idea of transition becomes central not just to myth, but to how people understand existence itself. Life is no longer seen as a static condition, but as a continuous sequence of thresholds, moments where identity, understanding, and reality itself are reshaped. Birth becomes the first threshold. Death becomes the final one. But between them are countless smaller crossings. Choices, transformations, realizations, losses, and beginnings. And in that expanded framework, Hecate is no longer simply a figure at literal crossroads. She becomes the symbol of every moment where something changes into something else. This interpretation also explains why her imagery, torches, keys, crossroads, serpents, remained powerful long after traditional worship declined. These are not just ritual objects. They were representations of transition itself. A torch does not eliminate darkness entirely. It reveals just enough to move forward. A key does not create a door. It allows passage through what is already there. A crossroads does not force a direction. It presents possibility. And a serpent does not remain unchanged. It sheds its skin. Each symbol reflects the same truth. Transformation is not an exception in life. It is the structure of it. This is why the stories of Medea and Circe continued to be retold, reinterpreted, and studied long after their original cultural context faded. They were not just entertaining myths. They were models of human experience under pressure. Examples of what happens when a person stands too close to the edge of change. Medea shows what happens when transformation overwhelms the self. Circe shows what happens when transformation is understood and contained. And both remain tied to the same underlying force, the space between states where identity is not fixed. Even in later philosophical and literary traditions, echoes of this idea remain. Writers who came centuries after the original myths often returned, consciously or not, to the same structure. A character standing at a decision point that cannot be undone, facing consequences that reshape their entire existence. This is the enduring shape of the threshold. And it is here that Hecate's presence becomes almost invisible, yet still essential. Because she is no longer just part of the story. She is the structure that allows the story to happen. Without the concept of transition, there is no Medea, no Circe, no descent, no return, no transformation. Only static existence. But the world, both in myth and reality, does not behave that way. It moves. It changes. It crosses. And so, even as civilizations changed, even as beliefs evolved, the underlying pattern remained recognizable. At every point where something ends and something else begins, at every moment where a choice reshapes the future, at every boundary that must be crossed without knowing what lies beyond, there's still that same silent presence, not forcing the outcome, not preventing the crossing, but existing within the structure of the moment itself. The threshold remains, and so does the idea of the one who stands beside it. Not as ruler of destiny, but as witness to change. And as long as change exists, so does the space she represents. As Greek culture gradually merged into the expanding world of the Roman Empire, many of its gods were absorbed, renamed, or reinterpreted through Roman religious thinking. Some became closely aligned with Roman counterparts. Their identities blended into new forms. Others faded into more symbolic roles, remembered more in literature than in living worship. But Hecate followed a different path. Instead of disappearing or dissolving into another identity, she became more concentrated, more focused in meaning, not less. In Roman thought, she was often associated with the name Trivia, meaning she of the three ways, a direct reference to her connection with crossroads and thresholds. But even this Roman interpretation did not fully contain her. Instead, Her role expanded into something that was no longer limited to geography or mythic narrative, but moved into the realm of ritual practice and what people believed was possible through interaction with the unseen world. Because in Roman society, especially in its later periods, religion was not only about public worship of state gods. It also included private, often highly secretive practices, rituals meant to influence fate, protect households, or communicate with forces beyond ordinary perception. And in these spaces, Hecate's name became especially important. Not because she was universally worshipped in temples like Jupiter or Juno, but because she represented something those gods did not fully cover: the unstable boundary between control and uncertainty. Where other deities represented order, law, or structured domains, Hecate represented the moment when those structures could shift. This made her central to practices that dealt with transition in its most practical sense: life and death, illness and healing, safety and danger, success and failure. In households across parts of the Roman world, small shrines dedicated to her were placed near doorways or thresholds. These were not grand public temples, but intimate spaces of personal ritual. Offerings were left at night: food, small tokens, simple acts of acknowledgement that marked respect for the unseen forces believed to move through transitional spaces. Because in the Roman understanding, the threshold was not just physical, it was metaphysical. It was the point where influence could enter or leave, where protection could be maintained or lost, where fate could shift. And in this context, Hecate was not just a goddess of myth, but a functional presence in the logic of daily spiritual life. At the same time, something else was happening in the intellectual world. Philosophers and later religious thinkers began to develop more structured systems for understanding reality, increasingly separating myth from rational explanation. Yet even within these systems, the language of transition remained unavoidable. Because no matter how reality was defined, whether through philosophy, theology, or early scientific reasoning, the problem of change could not be removed. Something always becomes something else, and that becoming requires a moment of transition. In more esoteric traditions that developed during the later Roman and Hellenistic periods, especially those associated with what would later be called mystery practices or magical papyri traditions, Hecate appears frequently as a central figure invoked during rituals involving transformation, protection, and communication with unseen forces. Not as a symbolic myth alone, but as an active name used within structured ritual language. Her role in these practices is consistent with everything seen before. She governs the boundary where one state becomes another. But now, instead of being part of mythological storytelling, she becomes part of procedural knowledge. Something invoked, called upon, engaged with through ritual action. This shift is important because it shows how myth evolves when it moves from narrative into practice. Medea and Circe exist as stories that illustrate what happens when thresholds are crossed. But in ritual tradition, Hecate becomes the framework through which people believe those crossings can be influenced. In that sense, she is no longer only a character in myth. She becomes a method of interacting with change itself. This is why her symbols remain so consistent across time and context. The torch continues to represent guided movement through uncertainty. The key continues to represent controlled access to hidden states. The crossroads continues to represent decision points where multiple futures exist simultaneously. And the presence of dogs in her iconography continues to represent awareness of what others cannot perceive, watchfulness at the edge of the unseen. Even as the Roman world began to shift toward new dominant religious systems in its later centuries, these ideas did not disappear overnight. Instead, they were gradually transformed, reinterpreted, or absorbed into new symbolic frameworks. But the underlying structure, the idea that reality contains points of transition that require guidance or understanding, remained. And in that persistence, Hecate's influence continued indirectly, even when her name was no longer spoken openly in many places. Because once an idea becomes embedded in how people understand change itself, it does not require constant naming to continue existing. It becomes part of interpretation, part of language, part of thought. And so, even as formal worship declined, the image of Hecate as a threshold figure persisted in literature, folklore, and later mystical traditions that would develop across Europe. She became associated with night journeys, hidden knowledge, protective rituals, and the idea that certain spaces, physical or symbolic, require awareness before crossing. Not because they are forbidden, but because they are transformative. And transformation, as all the earlier stories have shown, is never neutral. It always changes the one who passes through it. This is the final continuity between myth and practice, between Medea and Circe, between ancient ritual and later interpretation, between storytelling and belief. At every stage, the same structure returns. A boundary, a crossing, a change that cannot be undone. And in that structure, Hecate remains, not as a ruler in the traditional sense, but as the enduring symbol of the moment where one state becomes another. The moment that cannot be avoided, only experienced. As centuries passed and the ancient Mediterranean world fully transformed into a new cultural and religious landscape, the old mythological systems that once structured daily life no longer held the same public authority they had in earlier eras. The temples of the Greek and Roman gods were repurposed, abandoned, or reinterpreted under new dominant traditions that reshaped how people understood divinity, morality, and the unseen world. Yet even in this transformation, certain figures did not vanish cleanly. They persisted, not as openly worshipped deities, but as echoes within folklore, memory, and cultural imagination. And among them, Hecate became one of the most complex and misunderstood. Her identity, already layered from centuries of myth, began to shift again. Not because her essence changed, but because the way people interpreted the unknown had changed. In earlier Greek and Roman contexts, she was associated with boundaries, crossroads, thresholds, transitions, and the liminal space between states of existence. But in the medieval imagination, where supernatural explanation often merged with fear and uncertainty, these same concepts took on a darker tone. Crossroads were no longer only symbolic spaces of decision. They became places associated with hidden forces. Thresholds were no longer neutral points of passage. They became vulnerable points between safety and danger. And anything connected to night, transformation, or unseen influence was increasingly interpreted through a lens shaped by suspicion and moral tension. This shift did not erase Hecate's presence. Instead, it reframed it. Stories and folklore began to associate her with night gatherings, wandering spirits, and mysterious forces that operated outside ordinary human understanding. But even in these interpretations, the underlying structure remained recognizable. She was still linked to transition, not as a neutral cosmic principle, but as something that could be feared, respected, or cautiously invoked. Because even when belief systems change, the human relationship with uncertainty does not. People still faced moments they could not fully explain. Moments where decisions carried irreversible consequences. Moments where life felt like it stood at a boundary. And so, even in transformed cultural contexts, the idea of a figure connected to thresholds continued to exist in various forms. In early medieval folklore across different regions of Europe, references to night processions, mysterious female figures, and spirits associated with crossroads began to appear in local stories. These accounts were not uniform, nor did they always directly preserve earlier mythological details, but they often carried structural similarities, movement through liminal space, guidance or warning at points of transition, and the presence of a figure associated with night and transformation. Over time, these fragmented ideas were sometimes merged, sometimes distorted, and sometimes reinterpreted through the dominant religious frameworks of the period. In some cases, Hecate's name was preserved in learned texts or esoteric traditions that studied ancient mythology. In others, Her symbolic role was absorbed into broader concepts of spiritual danger, protection rituals, or cautionary folklore. But beneath these layers of reinterpretation, the core idea remained intact. There are spaces in life where change becomes unavoidable, and those spaces require awareness. In later medieval intellectual traditions, especially those concerned with categorizing supernatural belief, figures associated with magic, liminality, and hidden knowledge were often grouped together in increasingly symbolic or allegorical ways. Hecate's name, when it appeared, was not always understood in its original mythological context. Instead, it became part of a larger conceptual framework used to describe forces that operated outside ordinary explanation. At the same time, more structured philosophical and theological systems attempted to define the boundaries between acceptable knowledge and forbidden knowledge. Within this framework, anything associated with transformation outside divine order was often viewed with caution. But even here, the deeper idea could not be removed. Because transformation itself is not something that can be fully classified as good or bad in absolute terms. It simply exists, and human life constantly moves through it. This is why Hecate's symbolic presence continued to surface in unexpected places, even in texts and traditions that did not directly worship or reference her in earlier mythological terms. She appeared instead as an archetype, a figure representing the moment before change, the space between decisions, the uncertainty before action. In later magical traditions that developed during the Renaissance and early modern period, especially those influenced by the recovery of ancient texts and renewed interest in classical mythology, Hecate's image became more explicitly defined again, but in a different way than before. She was no longer simply a mythological goddess in a civic religious system. She became part of a structured symbolic language used to describe hidden forces, transformation, and the mechanics of change itself. Writers and practitioners studying ancient philosophy, astrology, and symbolic systems often returned to her imagery because it provided a coherent way to express something otherwise difficult to define, the point at which reality shifts from one state to another. In this intellectual environment, Hecate was no longer only remembered as a figure from Greek myth. She became a conceptual bridge between myth, philosophy, and symbolic interpretation. And yet, even in this more abstract form, her original structure remained unchanged. She is still associated with thresholds, still connected to crossroads, still tied to the unseen moment where decisions take effect and cannot be reversed. This continuity is what makes her figure so persistent across time. Not because belief in her remained constant in a literal sense, but because the idea she represents never stopped being relevant. Every human society encounters the same fundamental structure. Moments of transition, moments where identity shifts, moments where something ends and something begins. And those moments require understanding, even if they cannot be fully controlled. So in the medieval and early modern imagination, Hecate becomes both more distant and more present at the same time. Distant as a literal deity of ancient religion. Present as a symbol embedded in how people understand change, uncertainty, and the boundaries of experience. She is no longer just part of mythological storytelling. She becomes part of interpretive thought itself. And in that transformation, something important happens. The goddess of Crossroads becomes the concept of crossroads. The keeper of thresholds becomes the idea of threshold itself. And the figure who once stood between worlds becomes the framework through which people understand what it means to move between states of being. In that sense, her story does not end in antiquity. It evolves into something more abstract, but also more universal. Because as long as human life involves choice, uncertainty, and change, the structure she represents continues to exist, not as a character in a story, but as the shape of the moment itself. The moment before everything becomes something new. As the world entered the modern era, the old frameworks of myth, religion, and symbolic interpretation continued to lose their literal authority over how societies explained reality. Science, philosophy, and new systems of thought reshaped how people understood nature, consciousness, and change. Yet even as the language of ancient gods faded from everyday belief, something deeper remained intact. The structure those myths had always been pointing toward did not disappear. And that is where Hecate reappears again. Not as a deity people worship in temples, not as a figure feared in folklore, but as a symbolic presence embedded in how modern humans understand themselves. Because the modern world, for all its differences from the ancient one, still revolves around the same fundamental experience: transition. People still stand at crossroads. They still face irreversible decisions. They still pass through moments where one version of life ends and another begins without full clarity of what lies ahead. The language has changed, but the structure has not. In modern psychology, for example, moments of identity change are often described in terms of development, crisis, transformation, or transition. These are not mythological terms, but they describe the same internal reality that ancient myths once expressed externally. A person leaving one phase of life and entering another. Adolescence into adulthood, stability into uncertainty, grief into acceptance, ignorance into understanding, is moving through a threshold. And that threshold is precisely the space Hecate has always represented. Not as an external force controlling outcomes, but as a symbolic map for understanding what it feels like to exist in that in-between state. Modern storytelling continues this pattern as well. In literature, film, and narrative media, characters are frequently placed at decisive turning points where their identity must shift. These moments are often framed visually or emotionally as crossings, doorways, roads, dark passages, or literal intersections where multiple futures are possible. Even when Hecate is not named, the structure remains recognizable. A character stands at a point of no return, and everything changes. This is the same narrative architecture that defined Medea's collapse into irreversible consequence, Circe's controlled mastery of transformation, and the mythic descent and return journeys that shaped ancient storytelling. The difference now is interpretation. Instead of attributing these moments to divine intervention, modern perspectives often describe them in psychological or existential terms. But the underlying experience, the feeling of standing between what was and what will be, remains identical. And this is where Hecate's symbolic presence becomes most powerful in the modern imagination. Not as a literal goddess walking through darkness, but as a name that can be used to describe the experience of transition itself. Some modern interpretations in literature and philosophy use her image as an archetype of liminality, the state of being in between. She represents the psychological space where identity is not fixed, where decisions are not yet finalized, where the future is present but not yet formed. In that sense, she becomes less a figure of mythology and more a framework for understanding change. Even in contemporary spiritual or symbolic traditions, she is often referenced not as an object of worship, but as a representation of inner transformation. The process of confronting uncertainty, navigating endings, and stepping into new forms of being. Her ancient symbols continue to carry meaning in this context. The torch still represents awareness in uncertainty. The key still represents access to what was previously hidden or closed. The crossroads still represents the moment of decision where multiple futures exist at once. And the night still represents the unknown, not as something purely frightening, but as something not yet understood. What makes her enduring presence unique is that it does not depend on belief in her literal existence. It depends on the persistence of the experience she represents. Because every human life, regardless of time period, culture, or belief system, encounters transition. And transition always involves uncertainty. This is why the mythological structure surrounding Hecate continues to reappear in modern storytelling even when it is not consciously recognized. Writers, filmmakers, and artists often return to the same symbolic moments, standing at the edge of change, facing an irreversible choice, stepping into an unknown future. These are not coincidences. They are reflections of a shared human structure of experience. And Hecate, in her ancient form, simply gives that structure a name, not to define it, but to point toward it. So when viewed across the entire arc, from ancient Greek cosmology through Roman reinterpretation, medieval transformation, early modern symbolism, and into contemporary psychological and cultural interpretation, her story is not a straight line of belief or worship. It is a continuous re-expression of the same idea in different languages. That idea is simple, but never easy. Life is made of thresholds, and every threshold changes the person who crosses it. This is why Medea's tragedy still feels relevant. Why Circe's control still feels instructive. Why the image of the crossroads still resonates in modern storytelling. Because all of them describe different responses to the same condition, standing between what is known and what is not. And in that space, whether understood as myth, psychology, philosophy, or lived experience, there's always a moment of stillness before movement, a pause before decision, a silence before change. And that is where Hecate remains, not as a ruler of fate, not as a force controlling outcomes, but as the enduring symbol of that exact moment where one reality has not yet ended and another has not yet begun. The threshold itself, always present, always repeated, always waiting, and every time a choice is made that cannot be undone, her story is told again. In the modern world, the language has changed completely, but the structure underneath human experience has not. People no longer explain reality through the direct presence of gods walking among them. Yet they still live through the same kinds of moments that once required those gods to give them meaning. A person standing before a life-changing decision still feels it the same way ancient travelers once felt standing at a three-way crossroads. A moment where every direction leads somewhere real, but only one can be taken. No matter how advanced society becomes, that experience does not disappear because it is not about mythology, it is about the architecture of choice itself. This is where the ancient figure of Hecate continues to exist in a different form, not as a being believed in literally, but as a symbolic structure that still matches how human consciousness processes uncertainty. Modern psychology often describes these moments in terms like identity transition, decision stress, or life turning points. But beneath those clinical or analytical terms, the experience is still the same ancient pattern, standing between what was and what will be, unable to occupy both, forced to become something new through choice. This is exactly the space that ancient stories once filled with imagery of crossroads, torches in the dark, and keys to unseen doors. Because those images were never only about gods. They were about moments. The torch was never just divine fire. It was what awareness feels like when the future is unclear but must still be approached. The key was never just a sacred object. It was what it feels like when something hidden becomes accessible for the first time. The crossroads was never just a place on a road. It was the structure of decision itself, multiplied across every human life. And in that sense, the ancient myth never truly ended. It simply changed vocabulary. In modern storytelling, films, novels, even games, the same pattern repeats endlessly. A character is placed at a point where they cannot remain what they were. A choice appears, often irreversible. The narrative pauses at that edge, not because of external gods, but because human experience itself recognizes that transformation requires a moment of suspension before action. That suspension is the threshold, and across thousands of years, it is always the same shape. Even the stories of Medea and Circe, which were once told as mythic narratives about divine influence and magical knowledge, now read in modern interpretation like psychological case studies of transformation under pressure. Medea represents what happens when change is entered without containment, when knowledge, emotion, and action collapse into irreversible consequence. Circe represents what happens when transformation is understood, controlled, and integrated into stability rather than chaos. Both are responses to the same force, the crossing of boundaries that cannot be uncrossed. And behind both interpretations, whether ancient or modern, the same symbolic presence remains visible, not as a figure intervening in events, but as the pattern that makes those events meaningful. Because human life is not defined by continuity alone. It is defined by rupture and transition, by the moments where identity must be reformed, by the points where the past cannot fully continue into the future without change. And every time it happens, every time a person stands at a point where something ends and something else begins, they're living inside the same structure that ancient mythology once gave a name to. Hecate, in this sense, is not a character who acts. She is the name given to the experience of standing in transition itself. The space between certainty and uncertainty, between oneself and another, between what is known and what cannot yet be seen. And that is why her presence never truly disappears. Because as long as human beings continue to choose, to change, to leave behind one path in order to step onto another, that structure remains active, not as belief, not as worship, but as experience, a silent, repeating moment that exists in every life, across every era. The moment before becoming something else. The threshold, always there, always waiting, and always crossed. Across every version of this story, from the earliest myths of the ancient Greek world, through the shifting reinterpretations of Rome, through medieval folklore, through philosophical symbolism, and in a modern psychological understanding, there has always been one constant structure underneath everything. Not a character, not a single religion, not even a fixed belief, but moment, the moment of crossing. This is where the entire meaning of Hecate ultimately rests. Not in temples, not in statues, not even in ancient stories alone, but in the universal human experience of transition. Because every life, regardless of time or culture, encounters it. A point where something familiar ends, and something unfamiliar begins. In the ancient world, this was imagined as crossroads under the night sky, torches illuminating paths that split into different futures and keys that opened doors between worlds. It was given form through myth so that it could be understood, spoken about, and passed on. In those stories, figures like Medea and Circe were not just characters. They were human reflections of what it means to step through those moments of irreversible change. One shows what happens when a crossing consumes everything and cannot be undone. The other shows what happens when transformation is understood, contained, and shaped into something controlled. But both are still acting within the same structure. The threshold. Over time, as belief systems changed and ancient myth stopped being treated as literal reality, the figures themselves became less important than what they represented. Philosophers began describing change in abstract terms. Later traditions turned myth into symbolism. Modern thought reframed it again through psychology, identity, and personal development. But the structure never disappeared, because it was never dependent on belief. It was dependent on experience. Every human being, at some point, stand where those ancient stories always place their characters. At a decision that cannot be reversed in the same way. At a transition that changes identity. At a moment where the future splits into paths that cannot all be taken. And in that moment, whether or not the name Hecate is remembered, the structure she represents is still present. Not as a figure influencing fate, but as the shape of the experience itself. The pause before action. The awareness that something is ending. The uncertainty of what comes next. And the necessity of moving anyway. This is why the myth endures. Not because people continue to believe in it in the same way as before, but because it continues to match something real in human life. It describes what it feels like to change, to leave something behind, to become something else. And that is something no era can remove. Civilizations change. Languages change. Belief systems rise and fall. But thresholds remain. And as long as they remain, The structure of this story remains with them. So Hecate, in the end, is not simply a goddess of ancient myth. She is the name given to the moment where one reality becomes another. The boundary that cannot be avoided. The crossing that cannot be undone. The space where decision becomes transformation. And when the crossing is finally made, when the step forward replaces hesitation, when the unknown becomes the present, when one path is left behind forever, that is where the story ends. And where it begins again. Because another threshold always follows. Another moment of change always arrives. And the same structure repeats. Quiet, unavoidable, eternal in pattern, even if not in form. That is the final shape of the myth. Not a story that ends, but a pattern that continues. Every time a choice is made that cannot be reversed. Every time a life moves from one state into another. Every time a person stands at the edge of becoming something new. The threshold appears again. And in that moment, the story is alive.